In this video, we're continuing to discuss Plato's Republic, specifically dealing with the tripartite soul, the divided line, the allegory of the cave, and hopefully we'll also have enough time to discuss Plato's aesthetic, or aesthetic theory. What you see in the slide in front of you, I'll merely point out one or two relevant things. Specifically, Plato and Socrates identifying temperance, meaning moderation and balance, as of primary moral and virtuous importance, and self-mastery. And here, a person becoming their own master, as in a slave to no one, and also not a slave to one's emotions or desires. And that a person should be able to become, within Plato's ideal society, or utopia, a law unto himself, that when people have been successfully morally educated, extraneous laws or exterior laws become redundant or unnecessary. That is the benefit of moral education. People behave morally. If we want to criticize the failings of our society, we would do well to wonder whether we could morally educate the public. For Plato, however, this is specifically not a religiously based moral education. What's referred to as the tripartite soul, then, is when reason rules over spirit and desire, both in the state as well as in the individual. Here you see an image which attempts to represent that ideal, where reason, being the best, is at the top. Spirit and desire, being inferior to reason, are ruled over, both for a person individually, as well as for society. Although Plato refers to democracy as the sweetest form of governmental politics, he instead argues for a meritocracy, or more specifically, a type of elitism where the smartest and the best rule over everyone else. There is a distrust of the intellectual elite in our society, and certainly a system of governmental, political, and social hierarchy organized in this way would be very much in danger of corruption. This is what Plato and Socrates argue would be ideal. Imagine having Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Bill Nye the Science Guy as our ruling triumvirate. Would we have much reason to worry about climate change then? I personally doubt it. Notice that both for the individual as well as for the society, matters of the emotion and spiritual matters have been relegated to second fiddle. For Plato, as we've seen, these are inferior to reason, and so should be in second place. Neither for the individual nor for the society does Plato argue that religion should rule or dominate. There is a debate in our country, as well as around the world, about the role of religion in politics. When religion and politics are sufficiently mixed, it's called a theocracy, which is a system of government by religion. The United States of America was founded in opposition to old world authoritarian theocracy. However, there are elements clear in our political society which seem to desire to break down, to the greatest extent possible, any remaining form of separation between church and state. The philosophical question is, should they? And that's not a question I can answer for you. At the bottom is desire, represented by appetites or consumerism, perhaps capitalism even. For Plato, both in the individual as well as in the political society, desire, appetite, and consumption should be the lowest element. However, you likely would not be off the mark if you argued that our society, in fact, is ruled by consumerism, that the political economy of capitalism is truly what's in charge, that demand, profit, GDP, economic growth, and corporations, most simplistically, money, is what rules in our society. In which case, compared to Plato, our society is top-heavy, therefore likely to topple. But one would certainly be able to debate whether those sorts of criticisms are either accurate or justified. There is a bit of a debate about whether Plato is a feminist or a sexist. We do see Plato making the argument that women are equal in capacity to men in terms of the ability to be rational. Therefore, to that extent, women are equally capable of being philosopher kings and equally capable of political rulership. It seems the rest of world history did not choose to take this page out of Plato. We move now into what's called the divided line, which is made up of two parts. A top part, the realm of the intelligible, and the larger bottom part, the realm of the visible. The top part has, in the highest position, pure ideas, and below that, forms and understanding. In the higher part of the visible realm, you see beliefs and faith, represented by images. And below that, in the lowest position, opinions, represented by shadows. The higher realm is the realm of reason, science, truth, pure and eternal being, and pure reality. Whereas the lower realm is the realm of illusion, appearance, the realm of becoming and change. It is the mortal or temporal realm. And, according to Plato's logic, has less reality. Precisely because it's always changing. If we're very perceptive here, we can identify the influence of Parmenides on Socrates and Plato. Perhaps Plato and Socrates are trying to make sense of Parmenides' paradoxical philosophy, in which truth is eternal and unchanging, and yet the world is mortal and malleable, meaning changes. Perhaps they're trying to explain it to others, or even to themselves. But very likely, Parmenides would have been unhappy with his treatment by Plato and Socrates. Parmenides would have been unhappy because he had argued that the bottom part of this line doesn't exist at all. It is mere confusion. Whereas Plato and Socrates are providing it with just enough being to muck everything up. For Plato and Socrates, both the eternal and the mortal coexist. In Parmenides' terms, that is an inappropriate confusion. It's a relevant confusion historically, because later Christian philosophers will take up Plato's ideas and transform the eternal realm of truth into their heaven. For Plato, the intelligible realm is the place where mathematics exists. Mathematics are invisible, but we can understand them. And mathematics is eternal. And so Plato and Socrates were trying to make sense of the invisible eternals and their relationship to a mortal visible realm. I'm going to skip over these next few slides. I'll give you a moment to read through them. They simply describe the divided line. And focus on this slide and the one following it. We see here a definition of what's referred to as the Socratic method or Socratic dialogue, which is a style of writing, arguing, or teaching that involves the heavy use of questions asked back and forth. Even in this online format, I am attempting to continue to use a Socratic method by posing you questions to consider, rather than attempting to spoon-feed you what I think are the right answers. That is inspired by Socrates and his style. Likely you've had other teachers over your educational careers that have done similarly. The Allegory of the Cave is a thought experiment, which again are so quintessentially important to doing and writing philosophy, in which prisoners are chained up, looking at shadows dancing on a wall in front of them. One of the prisoners is unchained, and allowed to see the puppets and puppeteers that cast the shadows on the wall, and then is allowed to leave the cave and see the real world beyond it, but eventually has to return, symbolic of the philosopher king. An allegory is a story about one thing that's really about something else. You may have, in high school, read a play titled The Crucible, which was, on the surface, about the Salem witch trials and witch hunt in Massachusetts in the 17th century. But at a deeper symbolic level, the play was actually about 1950s McCarthyism and the Red Scare, in which Congress put together a committee to root out what it referred to as un-American activities, and to take American citizens and convict them for thought crimes, throwing them in jail and blacklisting them for any real or often accused relationship with the American Communist Party. A pleasant movie a few years ago came out called Trumbo, Trumbo, starring Bryan Cranston, the guy from Breaking Bad, as a Hollywood producer who runs afoul of this House Committee on Un-American Activities. This, then, is the intellectual main course. On it, you see both the tripartite soul as well as the divided line, as well as an image of prisoners chained up, staring at shadows on a wall, and puppeteers casting those shadows with a fire burning behind them. And then someone escaping the cave and going up to see not a mere wood-burning fire, but the sun itself, representative of truth, justice, goodness, and beauty. This allegory has metaphysical dimensions, epistemological dimensions, ethical dimensions, political dimensions, as well as aesthetic dimensions. We will attempt to cover all of those bases, because the few paragraphs which Plato uses to describe this thought experiment are perhaps the most important in the entire history of philosophy. We see the shadows on the wall These represent opinions in the realm of the visible. The people that are chained up have a metaphysic and an epistemology. Their metaphysic is that this is reality. The shadows are reality. The epistemology is what they can know are the shadows. So their metaphysic and their epistemology is limited. Once one of them is able to get up, their metaphysic and epistemology grows. They can see that the shadows are not the most real. Instead, the puppets or marionettes which cast the shadows are more real than the shadows themselves. Once they get up and leave the cave, instead of an image of a horse, or even the shadow of one, images, shadows, they can go out into the real world and see a real horse out here, and see a real bird, instead of the diffused light of the fire. They can perceive the sun itself. Then their metaphysic and epistemology can grow even further. They discover that the horse and the bird weren't ultimately real. They were just shadows or reflections of real horses, real birds. The outside world in this allegory represents what is called the world of forms and ideas. You should write down the following definition. The world of forms and ideas is a supernatural, perfect, and eternal realm in which the perfect ideas of things exist perfectly forever. The allegory is symbolic for a more complex metaphysic and epistemology that Socrates and Plato, likely inspired by Parmenides, are attempting to explain. Let's use some mathematical and geometrical examples to help make sense of why Parmenides, Socrates, and Plato would think that there is this supernatural, perfect, and eternal realm. A realm of universals rather than mere particulars. See these shapes at the bottom right of your screen. 3 right triangles, 3 circles of different sizes. Each of these particular triangles and circles, different though they are, represent a set of eternal truths, mathematical formulae, which express relationships. For the right triangle, the Pythagorean theorem. For the circles, their circumference and area. Whether we are looking at the iris of your eye, the circumference of the globe, or the size of the sun, all of those individual circles express one set of invisible but eternal mathematical truths. The formula for the circumference of a circle is not inscribed on the equator of the planet, nor around the pupil of your eye. But each of these miraculously expresses the same truth, a truth which is invisible but intelligible. Plato wants to identify some place where those eternal truths reside. And he suggests this eternal, ultimately real, unchanging realm of pure being, as opposed to becoming, is where those truths reside. Consider this ring. If the puppeteer holding it spun it in his hands, turning it 90 degrees, the image would be a line instead of an empty circle. Or if the puppeteer with the horse holds the horse closer to the fire, the image appears bigger. Farther from the fire, smaller. This is Plato's idea for how one eternal truth, or idea, could manifest in our physical realm as different particulars. Plato's idea is that in this realm of forms and ideas, the perfect form and idea of a horse exists, from which all horses get their horseness, or essence. Whether it be a miniature pony, a Clydesdale, or a stallion, all are reflections of the idea of the horse. And that, Plato is arguing, allows our minds to understand categories. Take, for example, a tree. You understand that a palm tree and a pine tree are both trees, although they look very different. Plato's argument is that you can understand their tree-ness, or essence, because all particular trees participate in the universal form of the idea of the tree. In the same way, the triangles and the circles participate in the universal form of those shapes. It gets even weirder from here. Plato's epistemology involves something called anamnesis. Anamnesis means remembering from before birth. Plato and Socrates' idea is that each of our souls existed in the world of forms and ideas before we were born. And when we come to this world, we forget everything we had seen there, until particular examples remind us of our past life's knowledge. So that when I see a pony, I recognize it's a horse, because my soul remembers from before its birth having seen the perfect form of the horse, which the individual horse reminds me of. And I'm able to understand it's a horse because I recognize its similarity to the eternal but invisible form and idea. Likely, what Plato has done is needlessly complicate epistemology. Plato's student, Aristotle, will argue all that's needed to make sense of categories is the mind, not a supernatural, invisible realm. Very likely, Plato, in mucking up Parmenides, sets the Western world on a tangent that it will take thousands of years to recover from. Let's end by focusing on the ethics and politics. What Plato is attempting to do is to apply the same mathematical certainty that one can have regarding geometry to ethics. And this is probably a step too far. He argues that the sun, which represents the perfect form and idea of the good, is what gives all good actions their goodness. The particular good acts of helping an old person cross the street, or donating money to charity, or protecting the weak from the strong. All these different goods participate in the universal form and idea of the good. And even though they're different, like the different particular circles or different images and shadows, various puppets and orientations of puppets, they all come from one eternal, perfect idea of the ultimate good. All individual beauties, whether a beautiful person or a beautiful society or a beautiful artwork, all share the universal form of beauty. Just individuals, just actions, and just societies all share the essence of the just, which is eternal, invisible, and intelligible, grasped through the highest of the faculties, reason. But this argument and philosophy likely suffers from a fatal flaw, which is that there is no convincing evidence such a realm exists. No reason to unnecessarily complicate epistemology or metaphysics. And therefore, instead of absolute, objective, eternal moral truths, we may instead be left with circumstantial, context-specific, or culturally relative ethics. The politics of this are manifold. In political terms, all of us have a variety of caves we inhabit. You're in one right now, staring at colored lights on a screen in front of you, with someone telling you what you see before you is reality. But it's not. You're staring at a computer screen. Reality is whatever is outside that window. outside the front door of your house, your personal cave. You know reality isn't what you see on reality TV. It's not what you read in books, in magazines, on your smartphones, and the internet. That's not reality. That's reality a step or two removed. When the political pundits and the politicians get up on screen and say this or that about healthcare, or on stage about war and strength, walls and illegal immigration, crime and nuclear weapons, or the economy, it would be worthwhile to attempt to peek behind the curtain and understand who is pulling the strings that make the politician's mouth move. What is the propaganda? What is the reality? The propaganda, in at least one instance, is that illegal immigration is an existential threat to our society. We either have a country or we don't. But the reality is that our economy is doing quite well. That none of your lives have been negatively affected in any way by immigration or illegal immigration. And you likely know that's true. Nevertheless, there's the scary shadows on the wall, but then the reality of real people with real lives and real children and real prisons and real deportations and real xenophobia and real racism. There's the scary stories and frightening images of thugs and drugs and a frightening world where you need a gun at all times. And then there's reality. The reality of the largest prison population in the history of Earth. Of what philosophers and justice theorists call institutional racism. The reality of the intention of the Second Amendment to protect the National Guard rather than the right to bring a long gun to Denny's. The same insight would apply to religion as well. You have the image, the way it's presented, the people pulling the strings, perhaps benefiting. The Jesus of Christianity, the Muhammad of Islam, the Buddha of Buddhism, the various denominations and personal interpretations of these dancing images at the front of the cathedral. And then you have reality. Whoever the real Jesus was, whatever he really did, whatever message he really presented, whatever he really wanted to achieve. And then you have how it's filtered down to you at a few degrees separated from the truth. We would all do well to try and peek behind the curtain in order to determine the relationship between what is real and what people say is real. Plato's Republic takes the form of a dialectic. That is, the use of reasoned argument in a conversation or dialogue between two people with opposing viewpoints in order to discover the truth. In the American court system, this is called the adversarial system. When you have a lawyer for the prosecution and a lawyer for the defense, each making their case as strongly as humanly possible, only then will the judge or jury be in the best position to determine what is true. And for that reason, whether we're discussing the afterlife and whether or not it exists, God or gods, whether or not such things like that exist, heavens, hells, angels, demons, and devils, whether or not those exist, or what is good, what is just, or what is politically best, even what is beautiful. In order to get the right answer, we must interrogate both sides, which we will continue to do if you have the courage to face down argument and counter-argument. Lastly, Plato has a counterintuitive aesthetic theory. Specifically, although you might think that a great philosopher like Plato would argue that a great society needs great art, instead, Plato argues that art is a distraction. First off, it's not truth. It's not reality. It's an appearance or a version of reality. If you had the option to spend your time after this video watching the television sitcom Big Bang Theory versus studying astrophysics, your time would be better spent and society would be better served if you study science rather than watch entertainment. Secondly, if I were to sculpt a sculpture of you, I would make all sorts of choices as an artist, whether to pose you heroically or as contemplative. to depict you as young or old. If I'm a documentary filmmaker, I can edit you to appear kind or mean, generous or stingy, wise or foolish. But if we want to understand the reality of you, we don't need to go to an artwork. We need to go to the thing itself. So Plato argues we go to the ideas themselves and not waste our time with mere representations of them. In our next video, we'll discuss the trial and execution of Socrates for exposing things the powerful didn't want exposed. And upsetting the comfortable viewpoints the society was accustomed to. Until then.